had always believed that my marriage to Matthew was rock solid. Sure, we weren't the perfect couple, but who can claim to be? Life moves forward, routines take over, and over time, the excitement naturally fades. That's just how things go, right? Or was I just telling myself that? That one evening, when Matthew was late from work again, I felt something new for the first time. It wasn't just irritation over his absence or frustration about the ruined plans. No, it was something deeper, an overwhelming emptiness. Like I was standing at the edge of an abyss and everything that had once connected me to him was unraveling. As I walked up the stairs to our bedroom, everything seemed as it had been in the morning. Yet that emptiness grew stronger. I sat down on the bed, closed my eyes, and suddenly it hit me, I was alone. Not physically. Of course, Matthew was there sometimes, but in my heart. I had been alone for a long time. That realization hit me like a bolt of lightning. I found myself remembering our early days together, when we couldn't seem to get enough of each other. Back then, he was full of life and passion. What had happened to that? Just as I was lost in these thoughts, the phone rang. It was Jacob, Matthew's son from his first marriage. He didn't usually call me directly. He always spoke with Matthew, so why was he calling me now? Hey, how are you? His voice sounded warm, but there was something in it that made my heart race. It's been a while since we last saw each other. Maybe you'd like to grab a coffee sometime. I felt an unexpected shift inside me, a strange curiosity replacing the tension I had been feeling. In that moment, just before meeting him, I realized this wasn't just about me and my marriage. Something much deeper was about to unfold. Meeting Jacob was nothing more than a casual coffee at a corner cafe, or so I had imagined. As I walked there, I recalled how he had always been a little reserved, staying in his father's shadow. I never considered him someone with whom I'd have a meaningful conversation, but maybe that's exactly why I agreed to meet him. When I arrived at the cafe, Jacob was already sitting at a table, idly stirring his cup. He seemed different, calmer, more assured, not at all like the times when he was with Matthew. I smiled, trying to ease my nerves. It was just coffee, I reminded myself. I'm glad you came, he said, his smile genuine, like he was truly happy to see me. How have you been? You look a little tired, he asked. Oh, the usual, I replied, brushing it off. I didn't want to get into the details, but Jacob didn't back off. It's about your dad, right? Things haven't been great between you two lately, he said, his eyes full of empathy. In that moment, I realized he'd been paying close attention to us. He noticed the tension, the distance between Matthew and me, and that realization struck me hard. You noticed? I sighed, my gaze dropping to my cup. We're practically strangers now. He's always working, and when he's home, we barely speak. It's not your fault, Jacob said unexpectedly, taking my hand. I froze. His touch was unexpected but gentle, pure support. There was something more to it, though, a quiet message that I couldn't quite decipher. Thank you, Jacob, I said, feeling a rush of gratitude. In that moment, I just needed someone to listen, and he was that person. We sat there for over an hour, lost in conversation, and I felt the weight of my worries lift with each word. Jacob turned out to be a far more thoughtful and interesting conversationalist than I'd imagined. When we finally left the cafe, he stopped suddenly and turned to face me, his expression serious. A strange tension filled the air. Emma, he said quietly, his voice carrying some hidden meaning. You deserve more. Do you know that? My heart skipped a beat. This was the moment when everything could change. But I wasn't ready for what happened next. He leaned in and gently kissed me on the cheek. There was no passion, no rush of emotions, just warmth and tenderness that sent a shiver down my spine. That kiss was so simple, yet there was something deeper in it than a mere friendly gesture. I felt like I was standing on the edge of something huge, but I didn't know if I was ready to take that step. I quickly turned and left, my mind racing. What had just happened? After that encounter with Jacob, I couldn't stop thinking about him. Seemed so innocent, so casual. But that kiss, the light touch, had left a mark on me. It was just a fleeting moment, But why did I feel guilty toward Matthew? Why did I feel like I had crossed some invisible line? Matthew, as usual, was absorbed in his work. The nights passed in silence, as if we were living in different worlds. But now, something had changed. I began to compare him to Jacob. Matthew's indifference to our relationship felt all the more striking against the attention and care I received from his son. The contrast was becoming too clear to ignore, and something inside me began to shift. One evening, when Matthew was again lost in his phone, I couldn't hold back any longer. Matthew, are we ever going to talk? My voice was sharper than I intended, but I couldn't stay quiet anymore. He looked up, startled by my sudden assertiveness, but then sighed. What do you want to talk about? Emma, I work all day to make sure we're okay. Isn't that enough? I froze. This was the moment I needed to lay it all out. But as I opened my mouth, I realized I didn't even know where to begin. A wave of hopelessness washed over me. Something had broken between us. But could it ever be fixed? Yeah, sure. Everything's fine, I muttered, frustration bubbling inside me. He didn't understand, and it seemed like he didn't even want to. Days passed, and I met Jacob again, this time at his place. He offered to help me with a project I'd been putting off for ages. Everything felt like it was happening so naturally. We sat in his apartment, sipping tea and chatting about small things. I felt more at ease there than I ever did at home with Matthew. With every word Jacob spoke, I felt the walls I had built around myself begin to crumble. Emma, you deserve more than just being a shadow in my father's life, Jacob said, his tone suddenly turning serious. His words hit me like a punch, as if he could see right into my most private thoughts. I'm not a shadow, I said softly, unsure if I was convincing him or myself. I replied, trying to smile, but inside I felt a tightness. Deep down, I knew he was right. When I stood up to leave, Jacob stepped forward, closing the distance between us. For a moment, I froze. In that instant, everything became clear. A thread of tension stretched between us, and I realized it was about to snap. Then Jacob kissed me again. But this time it wasn't just a simple touch. This kiss carried a sense of inevitability. It wasn't passionate or fiery, but it felt like a step into the unknown, into the abyss I had been unknowingly heading toward for a long time. My heart raced so loudly that I couldn't even hear my own thoughts. As I pulled back, my mind was foggy. What had I just done? After that kiss, I left Jacob's apartment feeling completely disoriented. It was something I hadn't expected, but in a strange way, it was exactly what I had been longing for. The world around me seemed to be falling apart, but I couldn't stop it. I knew I was doing something wrong, yet a voice inside me kept justifying every move. You deserve to be happy. At home, nothing had changed. Matthew was still immersed in his work, and I, like a ghost, moved through the house, trying to make sense of everything happening inside me. But I couldn't look at him the same way anymore. The connection we once shared felt so distant now, and I started to question whether it had ever been real. One evening, while sitting alone at home, I noticed that Matthew had left his laptop open. That was odd. He was usually very private about his personal things. I felt a stir of curiosity inside me, something I'd been trying to suppress. I had never snooped through his phone or computer before, but this time it felt different. It was as if fate was nudging me. I opened the laptop, and what I saw completely turned my world upside down. A conversation between Matthew and Jacob. But it wasn't just any conversation, they were discussing me. Matthew knew about what was happening between us. And the worst part? Not only did he know, but it seemed like he was watching as I slowly slid into this infidelity. I read every word with trembling hands. Matthew hadn't stopped this. In fact, it seemed like he had intentionally made me feel lonely, pushing me to seek comfort in his son. He had done this on purpose. He knew. I whispered, the truth sinking in like a weight in my chest. Matthew had been aware of our meetings all along, and he had allowed it to happen. I couldn't believe it. The man I had spent so many years with had been using me so coldly. He knew. I was struggling. I knew I felt isolated. And instead of helping, he let me fall into this. I had to talk to Jacob. Maybe he didn't know that Matthew had been watching us the whole time. Or maybe he did. The question gnawed at me. The next day, I couldn't think clearly. Everything I had learned felt like a constant noise in my mind. Matthew had known from the beginning. And the worst part was that Jacob might have been a part of this plan all along. The thought of that tore me apart. I called Jacob and asked to meet. We needed to talk. To get to the bottom of everything. He agreed. And we met again at the same cafe where it all started. But this time, everything felt different. The tension between us was palpable. As if an ominous cloud had settled over us. I found the conversation between you and Matthew. I blurted out, unable to keep my emotions in check. Did you know? Were you part of this? Jacob froze. His face darkened. And I could tell from his expression that I already knew the answer before he said a word. It's not what you think, Emma. He began. But there was a hesitation in his voice. I didn't want it to turn out like this. I really cared about you. I do care. Anger surged inside me. Then why? Why were you involved in this? Why didn't you tell me Matthew knew everything? Jacob sighed, covering his face with his hands. He looked lost. And for a moment, I saw the person he once was, the young man searching for himself. But that didn't excuse his actions. He had always wanted control. He started quietly. Dad thought you didn't deserve him. That eventually you'd do something. He was testing you. He wanted to see how far you would go. His voice trailed off, as if he was scared to continue. And I got caught up in it without fully understanding what I was doing. Jacob's words hit me like a hammer. Matthew had been testing me all along, using his own son to monitor my every move as I slowly fell into this infidelity. I felt trapped, like I had no way out. My life, my trust, it all turned out to be a game. I can't take this anymore. I whispered, tears starting to fill my eyes. This isn't life. It's a nightmare. Jacob reached out to me, his eyes full of regret. Emma, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have gotten involved. It all went too far. But I really feel something real for you. I wasn't just following my father's plan. His words cut through me like a knife. I didn't know if I should believe him or not. Maybe he was telling the truth. And there was something genuine in him after all. But none of that mattered anymore. This nightmare had shattered everything I once believed to be true. I stood up from the table, realizing I needed to leave. Jacob rushed after me. Emma, wait. I can't lose you like this, he said, his voice filled with pain. But I couldn't bear to listen anymore. As I walked out of the cafe, he caught my hand and kissed me again. This time, it was different, a kiss of desperation. It was the last gesture of someone who knew everything was already lost. A kiss filled with bitterness and regret. I pulled away, feeling a fire inside me. That kiss couldn't change what had already happened. When I got home, everything seemed to have lost its meaning. Matthew was sitting on the couch, absorbed in his phone, as if nothing had changed. It felt as though our life just continued on, unchanged. But now, I knew the truth. Everything we'd shared, every moment I had once believed to be genuine, had been under his control, part of his twisted test. We need to talk, I said, stepping into the living room. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might collapse. Matthew slowly looked up from his screen and glanced at me. His face was calm, almost indifferent, and that was the last thing I needed to see right then. I know, I said softly, the words escaping with a painful weight. I know about you and Jacob. I found the conversation. His expression shifted just for an instant, but I caught it. There was something like relief in his eyes, as if he had been waiting for this moment to come. And what do you want to hear? He asked, finally speaking as he leaned back against the couch. You already know everything. I'm not going to deny anything. I stepped closer, my hands shaking, not sure what I wanted from this conversation. Maybe an apology, maybe an explanation, but his indifference was suffocating me. Why? My voice cracked. Why did you do this? Why didn't you stop me when you knew I was making a mistake? Matthew stood up slowly, his face still cold and unreadable. Because you're not who you pretend to be. Emma, I've known it from the start. I watched you change. Watched you become someone else. I figured if you were so easily tempted, maybe our marriage wasn't worth saving. His words cut through me like a knife. He had been watching me all this time, treating me like some kind of experiment. And Jacob, his own son, had been part of it all. So this was all just a game? I asked, feeling my world shatter. You were just waiting for me to break? You broke long before you think, he answered, his voice quiet but cold with certainty. It was only a matter of time. I stared at him, hoping to see any trace of regret, but there was nothing, just emptiness. Then what now? I asked, tears threatening to spill, but I fought to keep them at bay. He let out a short laugh. Now you have a choice. You can leave, or you can stay. But whatever you decide, I won't be the one to support you anymore. I stood frozen, realizing that all bridges were burned. Our relationship, our history, everything I had once valued was gone. You won't even give me a chance? I whispered, but deep down, I already knew the answer. A chance, he scoffed. You've already decided everything for yourself. Emma. His voice was as cold and distant as ever. I turned away, unable to look at him any longer. I searched for answers, trying to understand how things had gone so wrong. But there was only emptiness. I had been deceived, used by both Jacob and Matthew. They were playing their own games, and I had become nothing more than a pawn in their plot. The next morning, I packed my things. There were no long conversations. No pleas, everything had already been said. I left, knowing that now I would have to live with the weight of my mistakes, the knowledge of my own weakness, and the deceit that had torn apart my marriage. As I closed the door behind me, nothing in the world seemed to change. I simply walked away, leaving behind something that had long since died.